Let me see your papers and identification immediately.
Excuse me?
Identification, now.
I'm an American citizen. I'm just waiting for my family at the carousel.
This is an international arrival area. Why are you here? You look out of place.
I work here sometimes. I'm a software engineer. I hold a security clearance.
Right, the system scanning faces behind you?
I help design.
Ice, on the ground! Do it now!
I'm not resisting.
Hands up! Don't move!
Unnecessary.
Taser! Taser! Ah!
Marcus, control shots fired with taser.
Stay
Medics
down!
to carousel
Hands where I
7.
can see them!
I'm down.
September 14, 2023, started as a regular Thursday afternoon shift for ICE agents Derek Sullivan and Monica Torres at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, until Sullivan spotted Marcus Webb, a well-dressed black man, standing alone near the international arrivals section, and radioed Torres saying, "Got a possible on Carousel 7, male, mid-30s, looks out of place." The two agents approached Webb from different angles, with Sullivan demanding, "Sir, I need to see your identification and proof of citizenship immediately," while Torres positioned herself to block the nearby exit. What they didn't know was that Marcus Webb had spent the last 6 years building the artificial intelligence systems that helped identify actual immigration violations. His background check file was thicker than both of theirs combined, and their decision to detain him in front of his arriving family would spark a federal lawsuit that would expose a pattern of racial profiling so egregious it would force policy changes across the entire agency. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. Marcus Webb was a 34-year-old senior software engineer at TechVision Solutions, one of the largest government contractors in the Pacific Northwest. He had graduated from Stanford with a master's degree in computer science and artificial intelligence, spent 4 years as an intelligence officer in the United States Army, where he earned the rank of captain, and now led a team of 12 developers building facial recognition and border security software used by multiple federal agencies, including the Department of Homeland Security. Marcus held a top-secret security clearance that required him to undergo extensive background checks every 2 years, the kind of clearance that took months to obtain and could be revoked for something as simple as an unpaid parking ticket. On this particular Thursday afternoon, he was standing in the arrivals terminal at SeaTac Airport, wearing khaki pants, a light blue button-down shirt, and brown leather shoes, checking his phone every few minutes because his wife Jennifer and their 2 children were scheduled to land in less than 15 minutes on a flight from Phoenix where they had spent a week visiting Jennifer's mother. Marcus had taken the afternoon off work specifically to surprise his kids at the airport because his 8-year-old son, Tyler, had been texting him all week about how much he missed their Thursday evening basketball games in the driveway, and his 6-year-old daughter, Zoe, had been sending him voice messages about the new dance she learned from her cousins that she wanted to show him the moment she got home. He was standing near Carousel 7 in the international arrivals section because Jennifer's flight from Phoenix was displaying on the monitors above his head, and he wanted to position himself where Zoe could spot him immediately, since she always made it a game to find Daddy first in crowded places. The arrivals terminal was moderately busy with the usual Thursday afternoon mix of business travelers, families, and airport staff moving through the space with rolling suitcases and welcome home signs. That was when ICE agent Derek Sullivan noticed him from across the terminal floor. Sullivan was a 15-year veteran of immigration enforcement who had started his career with Border Patrol in Arizona before transferring to airport operations in Seattle 3 years earlier. He was known among his colleagues for what he called his instincts about who belonged in certain spaces and who did not, the kind of instincts that had resulted in 17 formal complaints filed against him over his career, none of which had resulted in serious disciplinary action beyond mandatory retraining sessions he considered a waste of time. Sullivan stood near the customs exit area with his partner, Agent Monica Torres, scanning the crowd the way he did every shift, looking for what he described in his reports as individuals exhibiting suspicious behavior or appearing out of place in their surroundings. When Sullivan's eyes landed on Marcus Webb, he felt what he would later describe in his incident report as reasonable suspicion based on years of field experience. He saw a black man in business casual clothing, standing alone, looking at his phone, positioned near the international arrivals area where flights from Mexico, Central America, and South America typically discharged passengers. Sullivan picked up his radio and contacted Torres, who was positioned about 30 feet away near the escalators. Torres was a 7-year ICE veteran who had transferred from interior enforcement to airport operations 18 months earlier, and she had learned quickly that questioning Sullivan's judgment was not worth the tension it created during their 12-hour shifts together. When Sullivan radioed that he had spotted a possible immigration violation and gave her Marcus's position, Torres simply acknowledged and began moving to create what they called a contact formation, where one agent approaches from the front while another positions themselves to prevent the subject from leaving the immediate area. Marcus was reading a text from Jennifer that said their plane had just landed and they would be at baggage claim in 10 minutes when he noticed a man in a dark tactical uniform walking directly toward him with purpose. Marcus looked up from his phone and made brief eye contact with the man, who he now recognized as a federal agent based on the ice patches on his shoulders and the badge clipped to his belt. Marcus's first thought was that something might be wrong with Jennifer's flight or that there was some kind of security situation in the terminal. So he straightened up and waited for the agent to pass by him on the way to whatever actual emergency required attention. Instead, Agent Sullivan stopped directly in front of Marcus, close enough that Marcus could read the name tag on his uniform, and said, "Sir, I need to see your identification and proof of citizenship immediately." The words hit Marcus like cold water because there was no explanation, no context, no indication of what problem Sullivan thought he was solving by making this demand. Marcus glanced around to see if Sullivan might be talking to someone behind him or next to him, but there was no one else within 10 feet of where he stood. When Marcus looked back at Sullivan, the agent had his hand resting on his duty belt near his radio and handcuffs, and his expression showed no warmth, no apology, just the flat expectation of immediate compliance. Marcus felt his stomach tighten because he had been a black man in America for 34 years, which meant he understood exactly what was happening, even if part of his brain refused to believe it could happen to him. Not here, not today, not while he was waiting to hug his children after a week apart. He kept his voice calm and said, "I'm sorry, officer, but I'm an American citizen and I'm just waiting for my family's flight to arrive. Is there some kind of problem?" Sullivan's expression did not change, and before Marcus could say anything else, he felt another presence behind him and turned slightly to see Agent Torres had positioned herself about 5 feet behind his right shoulder, blocking his path to the nearby exit in the baggage claim area where Jennifer and the kids would be arriving in minutes. Sullivan repeated his demand, this time with an edge in his voice that made several nearby travelers turn to look at what was happening. "Sir, I am a federal agent conducting immigration enforcement operations, and I am ordering you to produce identification and documentation proving your legal status in the United States. Failure to comply will result in detention." Marcus felt anger rising in his chest alongside the fear, because he knew his rights. He had top-secret clearance that required him to know federal law better than most people, and he knew that ICE agents had no authority to randomly stop American citizens and demand papers without reasonable suspicion of an actual immigration violation. But he also knew that arguing with armed federal agents in the middle of an airport while his children were about to arrive was not a situation he wanted to create. Marcus reached slowly for his wallet, making sure both agents could see his hands, and pulled out his Washington State driver's license. He held it out to Sullivan and said, "Here's my identification. I'm a United States citizen. I was born in Tacoma, Washington. I live in Bellevue. I work as a software engineer. My wife and children are landing in about 8 minutes, and I would really appreciate if we could clear this up quickly so I can meet them at baggage claim." Sullivan took the license and examined it with a kind of theatrical scrutiny that made it clear he was not satisfied, turning it over, holding it up to the light, comparing the photo to Marcus's face as if the state of Washington might have issued a driver's license to someone who was not legally present in their country. Torres stepped closer and said, "A driver's license is not proof of citizenship. Do you have a passport, a birth certificate, or naturalization papers with you?" Marcus felt the situation sliding out of control because he knew exactly where this was going, and he knew that no amount of documentation he could produce right now would satisfy agents who had already decided he did not belong in this space. He said, "No, I don't carry my passport to the airport when I'm picking someone up. I have my license. I have my work identification if that helps. But I'm an American citizen, and I don't legally have to prove that to you without probable cause. The moment those words left Marcus's mouth, Sullivan's entire demeanor changed. His jaw tightened, his shoulders squared, and he stepped even closer into Marcus's personal space in a move that was clearly designed to intimidate. Sullivan said, "Sir, your refusal to cooperate is giving me reasonable suspicion that you are unlawfully present in the United States. I am now detaining you for further investigation. Put your phone away and place your hands where I can see them." Marcus felt his heart pounding because his phone was his lifeline, his way to contact Jennifer when she landed, his way to record what was happening, his evidence that this stop was unlawful from the beginning. He raised the phone and said, "I'm going to record this interaction because I believe you are violating my civil rights." That was when Sullivan grabbed Marcus's wrist and said, "You are interfering with a federal investigation. Put the phone down now or I will place you under arrest." Torres moved to Marcus's other side and her hand went to her handcuffs. And Marcus realized that these two agents were fully prepared to arrest him, to put him in handcuffs, to drag him away from this terminal, while his wife and children walked out of the arrivals gate and found him gone. He thought about Tyler, who was already anxious about flying without Dad, and Zoe, who had probably been talking about seeing Daddy for the entire flight, and he felt something break inside his chest. Marcus lowered his phone but did not put it away, and he said in a voice that was shaking with controlled rage, "My name is Marcus Webb. I am a United States citizen. I am a military veteran. I have top-secret security clearance with the Department of Homeland Security. And when my lawyer is done with both of you, you are going to wish you had walked past me and done your actual jobs." Sullivan's face showed no reaction to Marcus's words, except for a slight smirk that suggested he had heard similar threats before from people who ended up detained anyway. He said, "Sir, you need to come with us to a secure area where we can verify your identity and status. You can do this voluntarily, or we can place you in restraints. Your choice." Marcus looked at his phone and saw that Jennifer's flight had landed 2 minutes ago, which meant she and the kids were probably walking through the jet bridge right now, probably turning their phones back on, probably about to text him to ask where he was waiting. He had two choices, and both of them were terrible, but one of them meant his children would not have to see their father in handcuffs, at least not right away. Marcus said, "I will go with you voluntarily, but I am stating clearly that I do not consent to this detention, and I believe you are violating my Fourth Amendment rights." Sullivan nodded to Torres, who moved behind Marcus and placed her hand on his shoulder to guide him away from Carousel 7, away from the spot where he had been standing for 15 minutes waiting for the best part of his week, away from the life he had built that told him he was safe from exactly this kind of treatment. As they walked Marcus toward a door marked "Official Personnel Only," he managed to send one quick text to Jennifer that said, "Stop by ICE, international arrivals. Get lawyer, recording everything." He hit send just as Torres took his phone from his hand and powered it off. And the last thing Marcus saw before they pushed him through that door was the arrivals board updating to show that Flight 2847 for Phoenix had arrived at Gate C7. The holding room where Agents Sullivan and Torres took Marcus Webb was a windowless 12 by 12 foot space with cinder block walls painted institutional beige, a metal table bolted to the floor, and 4 plastic chairs that looked like they had been salvaged from a high school cafeteria. Sullivan pointed at one of the chairs and told Marcus to sit down, while Torres stood by the door with her arms crossed, blocking the only exit from a room that smelled like industrial cleaner and stale coffee. Marcus sat down slowly, keeping his hands visible on the table in front of him, and asked for the third time if he could make a phone call to let his wife know where he was, since she had just landed with their 2 young children and would be terrified when she could not find him in the arrivals area. Sullivan ignored the question completely and instead opened a leather portfolio that contained several printed forms and a tablet computer, then asked Marcus to state his full legal name, date of birth, place of birth, and current address for their records. Marcus provided the information in a flat voice because he knew that refusing to answer basic questions would only give them an excuse to escalate further. But he also stated clearly before each answer that he was cooperating under protest and believed this entire detention was unlawful. Sullivan typed Marcus's responses into the tablet with 2 fingers, taking his time, asking follow-up questions about how long Marcus had lived at his current address, whether he rented or owned his home, what kind of work he did that allowed him to afford a house in Bellevue, which Sullivan noted was a pretty expensive area for most people. The implication behind that comment was crystal clear to Marcus. The suggestion that a black man living in an upscale Seattle suburb must have obtained that home through some suspicious means. And Marcus felt his jaw clench, but he kept his voice steady when he explained that he was a senior software engineer with a master's degree from Stanford, and his salary was a matter of public record since his company was a government contractor. That information should have ended the interview immediately because government contractors with security clearance do not simply appear out of nowhere. They have been vetted and background checked and investigated more thoroughly than most federal agents ever experience in their careers. But Sullivan just nodded slowly and made a note on his tablet, then asked Marcus if he had any documentation with him that proved he worked for Tech Vision Solutions. Marcus explained that his work identification badge was in his wallet, which Torres had taken from him when they entered the holding room and placed in a plastic bin on the table like he was being processed for booking at a county jail. Sullivan made no move to check the wallet or the badge. Instead, he asked Marcus how long he had worked at Tech Vision, what specific projects he worked on, and whether any of his co-workers were foreign nationals, which Sullivan said was a concern we have to take seriously in the current security environment. Marcus was answering a question about his educational background when the door to the holding room opened, and Jennifer Webb appeared in the doorway, holding their daughter Zoe's hand, while their son Tyler stood pressed against her other side. Jennifer was a 33-year-old attorney who worked in corporate law at a downtown Seattle firm, and she had exactly the kind of commanding presence that came from spending her days negotiating million-dollar contracts and deposing hostile witnesses. She took one look at Marcus sitting at the metal table with 2 ICE agents standing over him, and her expression shifted from confusion to fury in the span of a heartbeat. She said in a voice that could cut glass, "What the hell is going on here? Why is my husband being detained?" Zoe started crying the moment she saw her father, not understanding why Daddy was in a scary room with police officers instead of waiting to pick them up with hugs like he had promised on the phone last night. Torres moved to block Jennifer from entering the room fully and said, "Ma'am, this is a secure area and you need to step back into the hallway. We are conducting an immigration investigation and you cannot be present during our interview." Jennifer pulled out her phone and said, "I am an attorney and that man is my husband who is a United States citizen, and if you do not release him immediately, I am calling our lawyer in the ACLU and every news station in Seattle." Tyler was staring at Marcus with wide, terrified eyes because he had never seen his father looked at like a criminal before, had never seen armed officers treating Daddy like someone dangerous, and Marcus could see his son trying to process why the world suddenly made no sense. Marcus tried to stand up from his chair to go to his children, to hold Zoe and tell her everything was okay, even though it was not. But Sullivan put his hand on Marcus's shoulder and pushed him back down into the seat with enough force to make it clear this was not a request. That physical contact, that hand shoving him back into his chair while his daughter screamed for him from the doorway, was the moment Marcus Webb understood that these agents did not care about his credentials or his clearance or his rights. They cared about exerting power over someone that they had decided did not belong in their America. Jennifer saw it too, saw the way Sullivan kept his hand on Marcus's shoulder for 2 seconds longer than necessary, and she started recording on her phone while demanding to know the agents' names and badge numbers. Torres stepped fully into the hallway and tried to close the door to block Jennifer's view. But Jennifer was too quick and wedged her foot against the doorframe while Tyler wrapped his arms around her waist and Zoe kept crying, "I want my daddy," over and over until her voice went hoarse. Sullivan finally looked up from his tablet and said to Torres, "Get her out of here and call airport security to help secure the area. We cannot conduct our investigation with these disruptions." Torres radioed for backup while Jennifer unleashed a string of legal threats that made it clear she was not some random spouse who could be intimidated into silence. She knew exactly what laws were being broken and exactly what constitutional violations were occurring in that holding room. Marcus watched his wife fighting for him while their children clung to her legs terrified. and he felt something crack in his chest because this was supposed to be a happy reunion. Tyler was supposed to be telling him about the swimming pool at Grandma's house, and Zoe was supposed to be showing him her new dance moves, not watching their father being treated like a criminal for the offense of standing in an airport while black. 2 airport security officers arrived within minutes, and Jennifer was forced to step back from the doorway, but she did not stop recording, and she did not stop demanding answers. One of the security officers, a middle-aged white man with sergeant stripes on his uniform, asked Torres what was happening and whether they needed assistance with the detention. Torres explained that they had detained a suspected immigration violator for questioning and needed the area secured while they completed their investigation. The security sergeant looked through the doorway at Marcus sitting at the table in his button-down shirt and khakis, then looked at Sullivan and asked if there was some specific reason they suspected this particular individual of immigration violations. Sullivan's response was bureaucratic and vague, something about behavioral indicators and subject's location in proximity to international arrivals, and failure to produce adequate documentation when requested. The security sergeant did not look convinced, but he also did not have authority to overrule federal agents conducting what they claimed was a legitimate investigation, so he simply told Jennifer that she needed to move back to the main terminal area and could not block the hallway outside the holding room. Jennifer refused to leave, stating that as the spouse of the detained individual, she had a right to remain nearby and observe the process. The sergeant suggested a compromise where Jennifer could wait in a seating area about 30 feet down the hallway where she could see the holding room door, but would not be blocking official foot traffic. Jennifer agreed only because Tyler was shaking and Zoe was hyperventilating, and she needed to get them somewhere calmer while she figured out her next move. As she walked away with the children, she called over her shoulder, "Marcus, do not say anything else without a lawyer present. I am calling David Chen right now." Back in the holding room, Sullivan closed the door and returned his attention to Marcus, with a new energy that suggested Jennifer's legal threats had irritated him rather than concerned him. He asked Marcus why his wife seemed so defensive and whether there was some reason she did not want him answering simple questions about his background and immigration status. Marcus stared at Sullivan and said slowly, "My wife is defensive because you are illegally detaining her husband for no reason other than the color of his skin while our children watch, and I am done answering questions without legal representation present." Sullivan smiled slightly and said, "Sir, you are not under arrest. You are being detained for an immigration investigation, which means you do not have a right to an attorney until we determine whether criminal charges are warranted. So I am going to ask you one more time, do you have documentation proving your legal presence in the United States?" Marcus had been trained in interrogation resistance during his Army intelligence work, had sat through scenarios where instructors tried to break him psychologically, but nothing had prepared him for the surreal humiliation of being treated like an illegal immigrant in his own country while his children cried for him 30 feet away. He said, "I have already provided my driver's license, which shows I am a Washington state resident. I have told you I was born in Tacoma. I have explained that I have top secret security clearance, which requires extensive background verification. If you actually ran my information through your systems instead of playing these games, you would know everything I am telling you is true." Sullivan made a show of typing something into his tablet, waiting while the device searched whatever database ICE agents used, then shook his head and said, "I am not seeing any results that confirm your claims. Until we can verify your status through alternative means, you are going to remain detained." That was when Marcus realized these agents had no intention of verifying anything. They were going to hold him for as long as they could get away with it, either because they genuinely believed their racial profiling was justified, or because they were too proud to admit they had made a mistake. Torres had been mostly silent during the interrogation, but now she pulled out a small notebook and asked Marcus if he would consent to them searching his belongings and his phone to help verify his identity. Marcus said absolutely not. He did not consent to any searches without a warrant, and he wanted to speak to his attorney before answering any more questions. Torres wrote something in her notebook, then exchanged a look with Sullivan that Marcus could not fully read, but which sent a chill down his spine. Sullivan stood up from his chair and told Marcus that since he was being uncooperative with their investigation, they were going to need to conduct a more thorough verification process which could take several hours. Marcus asked what that meant, and Sullivan explained that they would need to contact various federal databases, possibly reach out to his claimed employer, verify his military service records, and cross-reference his biometric data against known immigration violators before they could release him. Marcus pointed out that every minute they wasted holding him was a minute his 6-year-old daughter was traumatized and his 8-year-old son was learning to fear law enforcement. But Sullivan just shrugged and said, "Maybe next time you will have your documentation readily available when federal agents request it." The next 2 hours were a special kind of torture. Marcus sat in that holding room while Sullivan and Torres took turns leaving and returning, sometimes asking the same questions in slightly different ways, sometimes just sitting in silence watching him like he might suddenly confess to some imaginary crime. Through the small window in the door, Marcus could occasionally see Jennifer pacing in the hallway with her phone pressed to her ear, and he knew she was calling everyone she could think of who might have the power to end this nightmare. Tyler and Zoe were sitting in chairs along the wall, and every time Marcus caught a glimpse of them, his heart broke a little more because Zoe had stopped crying and now just stared at the holding room door with empty eyes, and Tyler kept his arm around his little sister like he was trying to protect her from something he did not understand. At one point, Sullivan left the room and came back with Marcus's phone, which he had unlocked somehow, and started reading through Marcus's text messages out loud, including personal conversations with Jennifer and work emails that contained proprietary information covered by non-disclosure agreements. Marcus objected immediately, stating that accessing his phone without a warrant was a violation of his Fourth Amendment rights. But Sullivan claimed that he had legal authority to search the phone of a detained individual during an immigration investigation. Torres photographed the contents of Marcus's wallet, including his credit cards, his health insurance card, his Tech Vision Solutions employee badge that clearly showed his name and position and security clearance level, and his military veteran's ID card that identified him as a former Army captain. That military ID should have stopped everything immediately, should have made both agents realize they had detained someone with more federal clearance than they would ever have, but instead, Sullivan just made a note that they would need to verify the ID was not fraudulent. Marcus asked how exactly they planned to verify a Department of Defense issued identification card, and Sullivan said they had contacts at various federal agencies who could run background checks, though it might take until tomorrow to hear back, since it was already after 6 p.m. Marcus felt panic rising in his throat because these agents were talking about holding him overnight, about keeping him away from his family for 12 or 15 or 20 hours, about putting him in some federal holding facility like an actual criminal, while Jennifer tried to find a judge who would issue a writ of habeas corpus in the middle of the night. Marcus tried one more time to reason with them, explaining that his company had direct contracts with the Department of Homeland Security, that DHS officials had his personal cell phone number, that he could have someone from his security office verify his identity within 15 minutes if they would just make one phone call. Sullivan listened to this explanation with a bored expression and then said, "Sir, lots of people claim to have important connections when they are being detained. We have to follow our protocols regardless of what stories people tell us." Torres added that if Marcus really had all these high-level connections, then surely his verification would come through eventually and he could be on his way. So there was no reason for him to be so agitated unless he had something to hide. That was when Marcus understood he was not dealing with incompetent agents. He was dealing with malicious ones who knew exactly what they were doing and enjoyed the power trip. He sat back in his chair and said, "I'm going to make this very simple for you. My name is Marcus Webb, employee number TK7734 at Tech Vision Solutions, security clearance level TSSCI with polygraph current as of March 2023. Project lead on facial recognition system Guardian, which your agency uses every single day at airports across the country. Call your field office, ask for the director, tell him you are holding Marcus Webb, and then start thinking about what you are going to do when you do not have jobs anymore." Sullivan laughed and said that was quite a speech, but they were not going to be intimidated by threats from someone who could not even produce a passport. Outside in the hallway, Jennifer had finally reached David Chen, a civil rights attorney who specialized in cases against federal law enforcement. Chen was already on his way to the airport and had called in favors with contacts at the ACLU and a local news station that had been covering ICE overreach stories. Jennifer had also called Marcus's boss at Tech Vision Solutions, a former Navy intelligence officer named Patricia Knowles, who did not appreciate hearing that one of her senior engineers with active security clearance was being detained by federal agents who refused to verify his identity through proper channels. Knowles made a phone call to the regional DHS director, who made a phone call to the ICE Seattle field office, who made a phone call to Agent Sullivan's supervisor asking what the hell was going on and why they were holding a clear government contractor without running him through standard verification protocols. Sullivan's phone rang at 7:43 p.m., more than 3 hours after he first approached Marcus at Carousel 7. He stepped out into the hallway to take the call, and through the door window, Marcus could see his expression change from confident to confused to worried, as whoever was on the other end of that call explained exactly who Marcus Webb was and what kind of federal disaster Sullivan had created. When Sullivan came back into the holding room 2 minutes later, his entire demeanor had shifted. He told Torres to gather Marcus's belongings, and he informed Marcus in a carefully neutral voice that they had completed their verification process and determined he was legally present in the United States. Marcus asked if that meant he was free to go, and Sullivan said yes, they were releasing him immediately and apologized for any inconvenience. Marcus stood up slowly because his legs were stiff from sitting for 3 hours, and he looked at Sullivan and Torres and said, "You put my children through hell because you saw a black man and assumed he was a criminal. You violated my constitutional rights because you could not imagine that someone who looks like me might belong in your America. And now you think you can just say sorry for the inconvenience and everything is fine." Sullivan started to respond, but Marcus cut him off. "Save it. You are going to be hearing from my attorney, both of you." Marcus walked out of that holding room into the hallway, where Jennifer wrapped her arms around him, while Tyler grabbed his waist and Zoe buried her face in his chest. And for the first time in 3 hours, Marcus Webb felt like he could breathe again, even though he knew the hardest part was still to come. Marcus Webb was not just any software engineer complaining about mistreatment by federal agents. He was the lead developer on Project Guardian, the artificial intelligence facial recognition system that ICE, CBP, and TSA used at every major airport in the United States to identify actual security threats and immigration violations. His security clearance was TSSCI, the same level held by senior intelligence officers and DHS leadership, requiring background investigations that went back to his childhood and interviews with everyone from his college professors to his neighbors. He was also a decorated Army veteran who had served 4 years as an intelligence officer with deployments to Afghanistan, and his military record included commendations for his work analyzing terror networks and developing counterintelligence protocols that were still classified. The irony was devastating. Sullivan and Torres had walked past at least 4 actual immigration violators, flagged in their own system that afternoon, to target Marcus based purely on his skin color. Security footage would later show them scanning the terminal, making eye contact when they spotted Marcus, and approaching him while ignoring a flagged individual standing 15 feet away. Their own body camera footage, which they initially tried to suppress, captured Sullivan saying to Torres 3 minutes before contact, "That guy by Carousel 7 looks illegal. Let's check him out." Marcus Webb filed a federal civil rights lawsuit 3 weeks later, represented by a legal team that included the ACLU and 2 prominent civil rights firms working pro bono. The lawsuit detailed racial profiling, unlawful detention, violation of Fourth Amendment rights, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and negligent supervision by ICE leadership. Discovery revealed that Sullivan had 17 prior complaints for racial profiling that ICE had ignored, and Torres had been flagged twice for improper searches. Text messages between the agents showed racist jokes about detainees and complaints about diversity hires in federal law enforcement. The trial lasted 6 days. The jury deliberated for 4 hours and awarded Marcus $9.4 million in damages, broken down as $2.1 million in compensatory damages, $6 million in punitive damages against the agents personally, $800,000 for Zoe's ongoing therapy for separation anxiety, and $500,000 for Tyler's treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder. Both agents were terminated immediately and faced federal criminal charges for civil rights violations under color of law. ICE was forced to implement mandatory training on racial profiling and constitutional rights. Marcus now speaks at congressional hearings about reforming immigration enforcement. His family still struggles with the trauma. Zoe still panics when Marcus leaves for business trips, but they are healing slowly and using their pain to fight for others who cannot fight back.
What's this supposed to prove? Anybody can print an ID like that. Why are you driving a city ambulance?
I'm a paramedic with Houston EMS, sir. Just finished a 16-hour shift. That's my city ID, my license. I'm also an Army vet.
And you just happen to have a birth certificate on you?
Yes, in my work bag. Born in Atlanta, Georgia, 1989.
Here, see the seal? This could be fake.
On a Tuesday night in March 2023, ICE agent Derek Morrison flagged down a Houston city ambulance and immediately demanded proof of citizenship from the driver, refusing to accept her paramedic credentials, her driver's license, or her explanation that she was returning from a 16-hour shift. He handcuffed Keisha Williams on the side of the road, filed a false report claiming she was combative, and kept her detained for 3 hours while backup units surrounded the emergency vehicle. What he didn't know was that his body camera was recording every second of his illegal detention, that Keisha was a combat medic who'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan, and that his pattern of racial profiling was about to be exposed in a trial that would make national headlines and end with an $11.6 million verdict. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. Keisha Williams was 34 years old on the night her life changed forever. She had been a paramedic with Houston Emergency Medical Services for 12 years, starting her career right after she completed her service as a combat medic in the United States Army. 2 tours in Afghanistan had taught her how to stay calm under pressure, how to save lives when every second mattered, and how to handle herself when people doubted her abilities. She had seen things most people couldn't imagine, had held dying soldiers in her arms, and had earned 3 commendations for her service to her country. After the military, she brought that same dedication to the streets of Houston, responding to car accidents, heart attacks, shootings, and overdoses with the same steady professionalism that had made her one of the most respected paramedics in the city. Her colleagues called her Doc because of her encyclopedic medical knowledge and her ability to diagnose conditions that stumped even veteran emergency room doctors. She had saved 17 lives in the past year alone, a record that her supervisor had submitted for a citywide excellence award. On March 14, 2023, she was driving Ambulance 47 back to the station after a brutal 16-hour shift that had included 3 cardiac arrests, 2 gunshot wounds, and a 5-car pileup on Interstate 10. Her shoulders ached from performing chest compressions, her eyes burned from exhaustion, and all she wanted was to complete her shift report, go home, and sleep for 12 hours. She was still in her navy blue paramedic uniform, with her name tag clearly visible, her Houston EMS credentials hanging from a lanyard around her neck, and her medical bag sitting in the passenger seat beside her. The ambulance was a 2022 Ford F-450 Type 3, painted in the city's standard white and red color scheme with Houston EMS in massive letters on both sides and emergency lights mounted on the roof. There was absolutely no question about what vehicle she was driving or what her profession was. She had her driver's license, her paramedic license, her military ID from her years of service, and her employee badge, all within easy reach because she had learned long ago that being a Black woman in America meant always being prepared to prove herself. This wasn't paranoia or oversensitivity. This was survival knowledge passed down from her grandmother, reinforced by her mother, and confirmed by her own experiences. Keisha was born in Atlanta, Georgia, at Grady Memorial Hospital on a hot August morning in 1989. Her father was a postal worker who had served in the Gulf War, and her mother was a high school English teacher who had marched with John Lewis during the Civil Rights Movement. Her family had lived in Georgia for 5 generations, with roots tracing back to freed slaves who had built lives in Atlanta after the Civil War. She had her birth certificate, her Social Security card, her passport, and every document that proved her American citizenship locked in a fireproof safe at home. She had never been arrested, never been in trouble with the law, and had a spotless record with both the military and Houston EMS. She was driving through the 3rd Ward neighborhood, less than 2 miles from her station, when she noticed the headlights behind her. The black SUV appeared out of nowhere, its high beams flooding her rear-view mirror with harsh white light. Keisha checked her speed and saw she was going exactly 35 miles per hour in a 35 zone. She wasn't weaving, wasn't running any lights, and wasn't doing anything that would justify a traffic stop. Emergency vehicles were generally exempt from routine stops anyway, especially when they were clearly marked city property being operated by uniformed personnel. The SUV stayed close behind her for 3 blocks, its headlights never dimming, and Keisha felt her stomach tighten with a familiar anxiety. Then the red and blue lights started flashing, and a spotlight hit her side mirror so bright it made her squint. She activated her emergency flashers, pulled the ambulance to the side of the road near a closed convenience store, and reached for her phone to text her supervisor that she was being stopped. Her hands were shaking slightly, not from fear of having done anything wrong, but from the exhausting mental preparation required for what she knew was coming. The driver's side door of the SUV opened, and a white man in his early 40s stepped out. He was wearing dark tactical pants, a black jacket with ICE printed across the back in yellow letters, and he had his hand resting on his service weapon as he approached. This was Derek Morrison, an immigration and customs enforcement agent who had been patrolling the 3rd Ward looking for what he called suspicious activity. Even though immigration enforcement was not typically a traffic stop function, and he had no jurisdiction over local EMS operations, Morrison had joined the ICE 8 years earlier after washing out of the Houston Police Department for what his personnel file delicately called interpersonal conflicts with diverse communities. His ICE career had been marked by an unusually high number of stops involving Black and Latino professionals, including 2 doctors, a lawyer, and a high school principal, all of whom had filed complaints that went nowhere. His supervisors had moved him between departments 3 times to avoid addressing the pattern, and he had learned that as long as he filled out the right paperwork and used the right language about reasonable suspicion, he could operate with almost complete immunity. Morrison walked up to Keisha's window with his flashlight aimed directly at her face, forcing her to shield her eyes with her hand. She had dealt with difficult law enforcement before during her years as a paramedic, had learned how to de-escalate tense situations, and she immediately opened with the professional courtesy that usually diffused these encounters. She rolled down her window completely, kept both hands visible on the steering wheel, and said in a calm, clear voice that she was Keisha Williams, a paramedic with Houston EMS, returning to station after completing her shift. She asked respectfully if there was a problem with the ambulance or if he needed medical assistance. Morrison didn't ask for her driver's license. He didn't ask about the ambulance registration. Instead, he shined his flashlight around the interior of the vehicle, lingered on her medical bag, and asked her a question that made her blood run cold in her veins. "I need to see proof of citizenship," Morrison said, his voice flat and official. "Immigration and Customs Enforcement, I need to verify your legal status in the United States." Keisha stared at him for 3 full seconds, her mind trying to process what she was hearing. She was sitting in a city-owned emergency vehicle with her name badge visible, her credentials hanging around her neck, and Houston EMS printed in letters large enough to read from a block away. She had her paramedic uniform on, complete with the patches that showed her rank and years of service. There was medical equipment visible in the back of the ambulance, including the defibrillator she had used twice that night to restart stopped hearts. Everything about her situation screamed that she was exactly who she appeared to be, a city employee doing her job. Morrison's demand for citizenship papers had nothing to do with the ambulance, nothing to do with any traffic violation, and everything to do with the color of her skin. Keisha felt anger rising in her chest, but she forced it down because she knew that showing emotion would only make this worse. She reached slowly for her wallet, announced what she was doing before she moved, and pulled out her driver's license. She handed it to Morrison along with her Houston EMS employee ID card, which included her photo, her employee number, and the city seal. Morrison barely glanced at them before handing them back. "This isn't proof of citizenship," he said. "I need a birth certificate, a passport, or naturalization papers." Keisha explained, still keeping her voice calm and professional, that she was born in Atlanta, Georgia, that she was a United States citizen, and that she was a military veteran who had served her country in combat. Morrison's expression didn't change. He asked her why she was driving a city ambulance if she was really a paramedic, suggesting with his tone that he didn't believe her explanation. The question was so absurd that Keisha actually laughed, a short, disbelieving sound that she immediately regretted because Morrison's face hardened. "Step out of the vehicle," Morrison said, his hand moving closer to his weapon. "Now." Keisha's training kicked in. She had been in dangerous situations before, had talked down armed patients having psychotic breaks, and she knew that compliance was her best option even though every instinct screamed that this was wrong. She opened the door slowly, stepped down from the ambulance cab, and stood with her hands visible at her sides. Morrison told her to move to the back of the ambulance where his dashboard camera and body camera would have a clear view. Keisha walked slowly, her mind racing through her options. She pulled out her phone and opened the voice recording app, announcing clearly that she was recording this interaction for her safety. Morrison didn't object, which surprised her until she realized that he probably thought his official report would carry more weight than her recording. He asked her again for proof of citizenship, and Keisha told him that she had her birth certificate in her work bag inside the ambulance because she had learned to carry it after a previous incident of racial profiling 6 months earlier that she had never reported. Morrison retrieved her bag, dumped its contents on the hood of his SUV, and found the laminated birth certificate that showed Keisha Marie Williams, born August 15, 1989, at Grady Memorial Hospital in Atlanta, Georgia. He studied it under his flashlight for a long moment, and Keisha felt a flicker of hope that this nightmare was about to end. Then Morrison said something that made her realize this was just beginning. "This could be fake," he said, pulling out his radio. "I'm calling for backup to verify these documents. You're going to wait here until we confirm your status." Keisha looked at her watch and saw that it was 11:47 p.m. Her shift had officially ended at 11 p.m., and her supervisor would be wondering why she hadn't returned to the station. The ambulance she was driving was one of only 12 units covering the entire southern section of Houston, and taking it off the streets for a bogus immigration check meant that response times for actual emergencies would increase across a 20-square-mile area. She thought about the patients she had saved that night, about the grandmother whose heart she had restarted, about the teenagers she had pulled from a wrecked car, and about all the people who might need help while this ambulance sat parked on the side of the road because an ICE agent refused to believe that a black woman could be a paramedic. Morrison called for backup, requested a supervisor, and settled into wait. And Keisha realized with growing dread that her night was far from over. The temperature had dropped to 52 degrees by the time the second ICE vehicle arrived, and Keisha was shivering in her short-sleeved paramedic uniform, while Derek Morrison sat in his warm SUV making phone calls. 23 minutes had passed since he had pulled her over, and her supervisor had already called her cell phone twice asking where she was with the ambulance. Keisha had texted back that she was being detained by ICE and to send someone to document the scene, but she didn't know if the message had gone through because her phone battery was dying after her 16-hour shift. She stood near the back of the ambulance with her arms wrapped around herself, watching Morrison's silhouette through his windshield as he talked on his radio. Every few minutes, a car would pass by and slow down to look at the scene, and Keisha wondered what they saw when they looked at her standing there in her uniform next to a city emergency vehicle surrounded by federal agents. She wondered if they assumed she had done something wrong, if they thought she was a criminal, or if they recognized the injustice of what was happening. The backup unit that arrived was driven by Agent Patricia Chen, a 15-year ICE veteran who had worked with Morrison before and knew his reputation. Chen was in her late 40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude that had earned her respect throughout the Houston field office. She had joined ICE because she believed in enforcing immigration law fairly and professionally, but over the years she had watched the agency become a magnet for agents who used their badges to act out their prejudices. Morrison had been on her watch list for months, and when she heard his radio call about detaining a paramedic driving an ambulance, every alarm bell in her head went off. She pulled up behind Morrison's SUV and immediately walked over to where Keisha was standing, and what she saw made her jaw tighten with anger. A black woman in a Houston EMS uniform, standing next to a clearly marked city ambulance, shivering in the cold while Morrison treated her like a criminal. Chen introduced herself to Keisha and asked what was happening, and Keisha explained the entire situation in the calm, factual tone she used when giving patient reports to emergency room doctors. Chen walked over to Morrison's vehicle and asked him directly why he had stopped a city ambulance and what probable cause he had for detaining a uniformed paramedic. Morrison handed her Keisha's birth certificate and said he needed to verify its authenticity because he had reasonable suspicion that it might be fraudulent. Chen looked at the document, looked at Keisha's driver's license and EMS credentials, and asked Morrison what specific factors had led him to suspect fraud. Morrison's answer revealed everything Chen needed to know about his motivations. He said that Keisha had seemed nervous when he approached, that her explanation for driving the ambulance seemed rehearsed, and that in his experience, people who were legally present in the country didn't get defensive when asked for citizenship papers. Chen's expression went cold. She had heard these same justifications before from agents who were profiling, and she knew that Morrison's reasonable suspicion was based entirely on Keisha's race. She told Morrison that nothing he had described constituted probable cause for an immigration stop, and that he needed to release Keisha immediately. Morrison refused. He said he had already called for a supervisor and that he wanted someone from ICE's document fraud unit to examine the birth certificate before he let Keisha go. Chen pointed out that it was nearly midnight, that the document fraud unit wouldn't have anyone available until morning, and that holding a city employee for 12 hours because of a hunch was insane. Morrison doubled down, saying that if Chen wasn't going to support him, she could leave the scene. The argument between the two agents escalated, with Chen accusing Morrison of racial profiling and Morrison accusing Chen of not taking border security seriously. Keisha listened to them argue about her citizenship status, her legitimacy, her right to exist in the country where she was born, and she felt a rage building inside her that she had never experienced before. She had served her country in combat, had saved countless lives, had done everything society asked of her, and she was standing on the side of the road in Houston, Texas, being treated like an illegal immigrant because a racist federal agent couldn't accept that she belonged in her uniform. At 12:14 a.m., Morrison made a decision that would ultimately destroy his career. He walked over to Keisha and told her that since she was refusing to cooperate with his investigation, he was going to detain her until her status could be verified. Keisha stared at him in disbelief and asked him to clarify what he meant by detain. Morrison pulled out his handcuffs and told her to turn around and put her hands behind her back. Chen immediately stepped between them and told Morrison that he was making a catastrophic mistake, that handcuffing a city employee who had provided multiple forms of identification was going to result in a lawsuit that would destroy him. Morrison ignored her, pushed past her, and grabbed Keisha's arm. The moment his hand touched her, Keisha's body went into autopilot. Years of military training kicked in, and she jerked her arm away from him with enough force to make Morrison stumble backward. He immediately reached for his weapon and shouted that she was resisting arrest, and Chen shouted at him to stand down, and Keisha put her hands up and said clearly into her phone's recording that she was not resisting and that she feared for her life. Morrison didn't draw his weapon, but he did grab Keisha's arms and forced them behind her back while she stood completely still and repeated over and over that she was not resisting. The handcuffs went on tight enough to hurt, tight enough that they would leave bruises on her wrists that would last for weeks. Chen was on her radio calling for a supervisor and requesting that the Houston Police Department send a unit to the scene because the situation was spiraling out of control. Keisha was placed in the back of Morrison's SUV, still handcuffed, still in her paramedic uniform, and Morrison closed the door and returned to his vehicle to continue his calls. Through the window, Keisha could see Chen pacing back and forth with her phone pressed to her ear, and she could see Morrison sitting in his SUV typing on his laptop. She realized he was writing his report, creating his official version of events that would justify everything he had done to her. Her wrists throbbed where the metal cut into her skin, and she felt tears burning in her eyes that she refused to let fall because she knew that crying would give Morrison exactly what he wanted. At 12:31 a.m., Houston Police Department officer James Martinez arrived at the scene. Martinez was a 10-year veteran of HPD who had worked closely with Houston EMS on hundreds of calls, and he recognized Ambulance 47 immediately because he had seen it at the station dozens of times. When he saw Keisha sitting handcuffed in the back of Morrison's SUV, his confusion turned to anger. Martinez knew Keisha personally because she had saved his partner's life 2 years earlier when the officer had been shot during a traffic stop. Keisha had kept pressure on the wound, had fought to keep him conscious during the ambulance ride, and had refused to give up even when his heart had stopped twice. Martinez walked straight to Morrison's vehicle and demanded to know why one of Houston's best paramedics was sitting in handcuffs. Morrison explained that he was conducting an immigration investigation and that Keisha had resisted when he attempted to detain her. Martinez asked to see Morrison's body camera footage of the alleged resistance, and Morrison said the footage was evidence in an ongoing investigation and he couldn't share it. Martinez called his supervisor and explained the situation, and within minutes, 2 more HPD units arrived at the scene. The standoff had now grown to include 3 ICE agents, 3 Houston police officers, and a handcuffed paramedic sitting in the back of a federal vehicle. Keisha watched through the window as the officers argued with the agents about jurisdiction, about probable cause, and about whether ICE had any legal authority to detain a city employee who was operating a city vehicle. The argument went in circles for another 40 minutes while Keisha sat in the cold SUV with her hands cuffed behind her back and her shoulders screaming in pain. At one point, Martinez knocked on the window and mouthed the words, "I'm sorry," to her, and Keisha nodded because she knew this wasn't his fault, and there was nothing he could do against federal agents who were determined to flex their authority. At 1:47 a.m., ICE Supervisory Agent Richard Thompson arrived at the scene. Thompson was a career law enforcement officer who had worked his way up through ICE's ranks over 20 years, and he had a reputation for running a tight ship that didn't tolerate cowboy behavior from his agents. He took one look at the scene with a handcuffed paramedic in the back of Morrison's vehicle and 3 HPD officers standing guard over a city ambulance, and he knew immediately that Morrison had screwed up badly. Thompson ordered Morrison to release Keisha from the handcuffs, and Morrison protested that she had resisted arrest and needed to remain in custody until her documents were verified. Thompson asked Morrison what crime Keisha had committed that justified arresting her, and Morrison said she was suspected of being illegally present in the United States. Thompson asked what evidence supported that suspicion, and Morrison started listing the same reasons he had given to Chen earlier: the nervous behavior, the rehearsed explanation, the defensive attitude. Thompson cut him off and asked if Keisha had provided a birth certificate showing she was born in Georgia. Morrison admitted she had. Thompson asked if the birth certificate showed any obvious signs of being fraudulent. Morrison admitted it didn't. Thompson asked if Keisha had provided a driver's license, an employee ID, and multiple other forms of identification. Morrison admitted she had. Thompson asked Morrison if he had any actual evidence, any real reason to believe that Keisha was not exactly who she claimed to be. Morrison hesitated, and in that hesitation, Thompson saw the truth. This wasn't about immigration enforcement or document fraud or national security. This was about a black woman in a position of authority and an agent who couldn't accept that she belonged there. Thompson walked to Morrison's SUV, opened the back door, and personally removed the handcuffs from Keisha's wrists. He apologized to her on behalf of ICE, told her she was free to go, and promised her that there would be an internal investigation into Morrison's conduct. Keisha stepped out of the SUV at 1:52 a.m., nearly 3 hours after Morrison had first pulled her over. Her wrists were bruised and bleeding slightly where the handcuffs had cut into her skin. Her shoulders ached from being forced into an unnatural position for so long. Her phone was dead, her supervisor had sent 2 other paramedics to check on her, and Ambulance 47 had been sitting on the side of the road unavailable for emergencies for 3 full hours. Martinez walked her back to the ambulance and offered to follow her to the station to make sure she got there safely. And Keisha accepted because her hands were shaking so badly she wasn't sure she could drive. Chen approached her and said she was going to file a formal complaint about Morrison's conduct, and Keisha thanked her, but her voice sounded hollow even to her own ears. Thompson handed her his business card and told her to contact him if she wanted to pursue this further, and Keisha took the card and put it in her pocket without looking at it. She climbed back into the ambulance cab and sat in the driver's seat, staring at the steering wheel. 3 hours. 3 hours of her life stolen because a federal agent saw her black face and decided she didn't belong in her uniform. 3 hours that a critical emergency vehicle was unavailable to respond to calls. 3 hours that she would never get back, that had changed something fundamental inside her that she couldn't name yet but could feel breaking apart. Martinez was waiting in his patrol car with his lights on, ready to escort her, and Keisha started the engine and pulled back into the street. Her hands were still shaking, and she realized that she was crying without having noticed when the tears started. She drove the 2 miles to the station with Martinez following behind her, parked the ambulance in its assigned bay, and walked into the building where her supervisor was waiting, with a look of horror on his face. What Keisha didn't know yet, what none of them knew yet, was that Morrison had filed his report before Thompson arrived. In that report, Morrison claimed that Keisha had been combative and aggressive, that she had refused to provide identification, and that she had physically resisted when he attempted to detain her. He described her as suspicious and evasive, and he recommended that ICE open a full investigation into her immigration status. The report was a lie from beginning to end, and it was now part of Keisha's permanent federal record. Morrison had created a paper trail that would follow her for years, that would show up on background checks, that would mark her as someone who had been investigated by immigration and customs enforcement. He had weaponized his authority to punish her for the crime of being black in America, and he thought he had gotten away with it. But Morrison's body camera had been recording the entire encounter, and so had Chen's, and so had the dashboard cameras in all 3 HPD vehicles. Keisha's phone had captured audio of everything Morrison had said to her. Civilian witnesses had filmed portions of the stop and posted them to social media. And while Morrison sat in his office at 2:30 a.m. writing his false report, the evidence that would destroy him was already spreading across the internet, being downloaded and saved and shared by people who recognized injustice when they saw it. The consequences were coming for Derek Morrison, but they were also coming for Keisha Williams, because trauma doesn't wait for lawsuits to be filed or justice to be served. The damage had already been done. Keisha tried to return to work 4 days after the incident, but the moment she climbed into an ambulance, her hands started shaking and her breathing became shallow and rapid. Her supervisor sent her home and recommended she see a therapist who specialized in trauma. The diagnosis came back as acute post-traumatic stress disorder, triggered by the 3-hour detention and the feeling of complete helplessness she had experienced in Morrison's handcuffs. She couldn't sleep without nightmares of being arrested again, couldn't drive without checking her rearview mirror constantly, and couldn't put on her uniform without remembering how Morrison had looked at her, like she didn't belong in it. Meanwhile, the videos from that night had gone viral. Civilian footage showed Keisha standing in her paramedic uniform, shivering in the cold while Morrison sat in his warm vehicle. The body camera footage that ICE was forced to release through a public records request showed Morrison's lies in crystal clear detail. His report claimed Keisha had been combative, but the video showed her calm and professional throughout the encounter. Keisha's attorney uncovered what ICE had been hiding for years. Morrison had 47 documented complaints of racial profiling that the agency had systematically ignored. He had targeted doctors, lawyers, teachers, and other professionals of color, always using the same playbook of demanding citizenship papers and filing false reports when challenged. The pattern was undeniable, and ICE's failure to stop him made the agency liable. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The jury watched Morrison's body camera footage and heard him demand citizenship papers from a woman in a city uniform driving a marked emergency vehicle. They saw the bruises on Keisha's wrist from the handcuffs. They heard expert testimony about how Morrison's illegal detention had delayed emergency response across 20 square miles of Houston. The verdict came back unanimous: $11.6 million in damages. Morrison was fired immediately and faced federal civil rights charges. ICE was forced to implement mandatory bias training and civilian oversight. Keisha used her settlement to start a foundation that provides legal support to victims of racial profiling by law enforcement. She never returned to full-time paramedic work. The career she loved, the calling she had dedicated her life to, was stolen by 3 hours of hatred wrapped in a badge.
Open! Doors open! Move! Hands! Let me see your hands!
They're up. I'm not resisting.
Where's Marco Vasquez?
My name's Marcus Washington, U.S. citizen, Marine Corps vet.
Stay back, ma'am.
You have a warrant? I want to see it.
We'll find what we need. Keep those hands up.
That box on the wall, those medals are mine. 3 tours in Iraq, Silver Star. It's all on my discharge papers right there.
Probably printed up.
At 5:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, ICE Supervisor Derek Morrison authorized a no-knock raid on 2847 Maple Street, sending 6 armed agents crashing through Marcus Washington's front door while his family slept, based on nothing more than an anonymous tip that someone named Marco Vasquez lived there. Morrison had made a career out of these raids, targeting predominantly Black and Latino neighborhoods with warrantless entries, using the excuse of imminent flight risk to bypass constitutional protections he considered paperwork obstacles. He never verified the tip, never cross-checked the name against property records, never considered that a decorated veteran might be sleeping in that bed. What Morrison didn't know was that Marcus Washington had survived IED attacks in Fallujah, earned a Purple Heart and Silver Star, and possessed the discipline and documentation to fight back through every legal channel available. And this 12-minute raid would ultimately cost the agency $19.5 million, end Morrison's career in federal law enforcement, and create legal precedent that would be cited in civil rights cases for the next decade. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. Marcus Washington was 38 years old, a Marine sergeant who had served 12 years before retiring with full honors in 2019. He had done 3 tours in Iraq, earned a Silver Star for pulling 2 Marines from a burning Humvee under enemy fire, and received a Purple Heart after shrapnel tore through his left shoulder during a patrol in Fallujah. After leaving the Marines, Marcus returned to his hometown of Richmond, Virginia, where he worked as a logistics coordinator for a shipping company and lived quietly with his wife Teresa and their 2 daughters, 8-year-old Amara and 11-year-old Zoe. His home on Maple Street was modest but proud, with an American flag mounted by the front door and a shadow box in the living room displaying his medals and service ribbons. On the morning of March 15th, Marcus was sleeping peacefully in his own bed, in his own home, in the country he had bled for. The sound that woke him was not an alarm or his daughters getting ready for school. It was the explosive crack of his front door being smashed open by a battering ram. Marcus's military training kicked in instantly. His eyes snapped open, his body already moving before his mind fully processed what was happening. He heard Teresa scream beside him, heard heavy boots pounding through his house, heard men shouting commands in a language that made no sense for this moment. Marcus threw himself out of bed and moved toward the bedroom door, his hands already rising in a non-threatening position because he knew what armed men in high-stress situations could do. When he stepped into the hallway, he found himself staring down the barrels of 3 rifles, held by men in tactical gear, with the ice patches on their shoulders. The lead agent was a stocky white man in his early 40s, with a shaved head and a voice that filled the hallway with aggression. This was Derek Morrison, though Marcus wouldn't learn his name until later. Morrison had been with ICE for 6 years and had built a reputation in the Richmond field office for what he called proactive enforcement. His supervisors praised his arrest numbers. His colleagues whispered about his methods. Morrison had a pattern of targeting neighborhoods based on demographics rather than intelligence, of treating every door like it hid a dangerous criminal, of viewing constitutional protections as inconveniences that slow down real police work. He had conducted 47 raids in the past 18 months, and in Morrison's mind, the end always justified the means. Morrison looked at Marcus standing in his hallway in boxer shorts and a t-shirt, hands raised, and saw exactly what he expected to see. Not a veteran, not a citizen, not a man who had earned the right to feel safe in his own home. Morrison saw a target, and he moved forward with the confidence of a man who believed his badge made him untouchable. He grabbed Marcus by the arm and shoved him against the wall, ignoring Marcus's calm request to see a warrant. Other agents spread through the house, their boots thundering on the floors. Marcus had refinished himself, their voices harsh and commanding, as they cleared rooms that held nothing more dangerous than sleeping children and family photos. Teresa ran into the hallway in her nightgown, her face frozen in terror, and Morrison's partner intercepted her with a firm hand and a command to stay back. Amara appeared at the top of the stairs, her small face streaked with tears, clutching her stuffed rabbit. Zoe stood behind her sister, trying to be brave but visibly shaking. Marcus felt his heart breaking as he watched his daughters witness their father being treated like a criminal in their own home. But he kept his voice steady and his movements controlled. He had survived combat by staying calm under pressure, and he would survive this the same way. Marcus told Morrison clearly and repeatedly that his name was Marcus Washington, that he was a United States citizen, that he was a Marine veteran, and that he wanted to see the warrant that authorized this invasion. Morrison dismissed every word. He kept asking for Marco Vasquez, insisting that Marcus was lying about his identity, refusing to look at the military identification Marcus offered to show him. When Marcus pointed to the shadow box visible in the living room, to the medals and ribbons that told the story of his service, Morrison barely glanced at it, He had made up his mind before he kicked down the door, and nothing Marcus said would change it. The raid lasted 12 minutes. Agents tore through closets, dumped drawers, moved furniture, and photographed everything they touched. They found Marcus's discharge papers, his passport, his military ID, his driver's license, all documents that proved exactly who he was. Morrison looked at each piece of paper with suspicion rather than recognition, as if citizenship documents were probably forged and military records couldn't be trusted. When Marcus asked again about the warrant, Morrison told him that exigent circumstances eliminated the need for one, that they had credible intelligence about an undocumented individual at this address, and that Marcus should be grateful they weren't putting him in handcuffs. Finally, after confirming through their database that no Marco Vasquez lived at this address and that Marcus Washington was indeed a citizen with no criminal record, Morrison made the decision to leave. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the terror they had inflicted, no explanation for why they had destroyed a family's sense of safety based on information they hadn't bothered to verify. Morrison simply told his team to move out, left Marcus standing in his destroyed living room with his traumatized wife and daughters, and walked back to his vehicle as if this was just another morning at work. As the ICE vehicles pulled away from Maple Street, Marcus pulled out his phone with shaking hands and began documenting everything he could see. Every broken piece of furniture, every open drawer, every detail of the violation that had just occurred. He was a Marine, and Marines didn't let battles end without fighting back. Marcus Washington sat at his kitchen table 3 days after the raid, surrounded by paperwork that represented every official channel the United States government offered for filing complaints. He had incident report forms from ICE, civil rights violation forms from the Department of Homeland Security, and contact information for every supervisor in the regional chain of command. His military training had taught him to follow proper procedures, to use the system before going around it, to give institutions the chance to correct their mistakes. He filled out every form with precise detail, attached photos of the damage to his home, included timestamps from his phone showing when the raid occurred, and submitted everything through certified mail so there would be proof of delivery. Then he waited for someone in authority to acknowledge that what happened to his family was wrong. The first response came 2 weeks later in the form of a generic letter that thanked him for his inquiry and informed him that the matter was under internal review. There was no timeline for that review, no name attached to the letter, no indication that anyone had actually read what he submitted. Marcus called the number listed on the letterhead and spent 40 minutes being transferred between departments before reaching a woman who told him she couldn't discuss ongoing investigations and suggested he be patient. When he mentioned that armed agents had terrorized his children without a warrant, she repeated the same script about internal reviews and ended the call. Marcus hung up and looked across the table at Teresa, who was holding a cup of coffee she hadn't touched in an hour, and he saw the exhaustion in her eyes that came from 3 nights of their daughters refusing to sleep in their own rooms. Teresa Washington had been a registered nurse for 12 years, working overnight shifts in the intensive care unit at Richmond General Hospital. She was 36 years old, a woman who had spent her entire adult life staying calm during emergencies and making life or death decisions without panicking. She had held Marcus together during his deployments, raised their daughters through 3 tours of duty, and built a home that felt safe even when the world felt dangerous. But the raid had broken something in her that professional training couldn't fix. She told Marcus that she woke up every night at 5:47 a.m. in a panic, that she couldn't stop seeing men with guns standing over their children, that she felt violated in a way she couldn't quite explain. When Marcus reached across the table to take her hand, she squeezed back hard enough that he felt her fear transferred through her grip. The breaking point came when Amara's second-grade teacher called to say their daughter had stopped participating in class. The teacher explained gently that Amara used to be outgoing and confident, but now she barely spoke and seemed to flinch whenever someone raised their voice. Marcus and Teresa took both girls to a child psychologist who specialized in trauma, and after 3 sessions, the doctor confirmed what they already knew. Their daughters were experiencing symptoms of post-traumatic stress, triggered by watching armed strangers invade their home and treat their father like a criminal. Zoe told the psychologist that she kept having nightmares about men taking her daddy away. Amara drew pictures during her sessions that showed their house surrounded by dark figures. The psychologist recommended ongoing therapy and gently suggested that the parents might benefit from counseling as well, because trauma like this affected entire families. Marcus started asking questions in his neighborhood and discovered that his family wasn't the first to experience this kind of raid. He talked to his neighbor 3 houses down, a man named Carlos Hernandez, who was a naturalized citizen and worked as an accountant. Carlos told him that ICE had raided his home 14 months earlier, also without a warrant, also looking for someone who didn't live there, also refusing to apologize when they realized their mistake. Marcus learned about a woman 2 streets over whose teenage son had been handcuffed in their driveway for 2 hours before agents accepted that he was born in Richmond and had never left the country. He heard about a family that had been raided twice in 6 months, both times based on tips that turned out to be false, both times resulting in property damage and no accountability. A pattern emerged that Marcus recognized from his military intelligence training, and the pattern pointed to systematic negligence rather than isolated mistakes. The local news picked up the story after Marcus reached out to an investigative reporter named Jennifer Hayes, who had covered veterans' issues in the past. Hayes came to his home with a camera crew, interviewed him and Teresa, and filmed the damage that ICE had left behind. She obtained public records showing the number of ICE raids in Richmond over the past 2 years and noticed that 73% of them occurred in predominantly Black and Latino neighborhoods, despite those areas representing only 41% of the city's population. When the story aired, Marcus's phone started ringing with calls from other families who had experienced similar raids, from local veterans organizations who wanted to help, and from lawyers who saw a civil rights case that needed to be fought. Derek Morrison watched that news segment from his living room and felt nothing but irritation. He had been with ICE long enough to know that media attention meant paperwork and scrutiny, but he also knew that complaints rarely led to real consequences. His supervisor had already cleared him in the internal review, concluding that Morrison had acted on credible intelligence and followed appropriate protocols for a high-risk apprehension. The fact that the intelligence turned out to be wrong wasn't Morrison's fault, according to the official report. The fact that no warrant had been obtained was justified by exigent circumstances. Morrison had received these kinds of complaints before, and they always disappeared after a few weeks when people realized that fighting the government was expensive and exhausting. He expected Marcus Washington to follow the same pattern, to make noise for a while, and then give up when the bureaucracy wore him down. What Morrison didn't understand was that Marcus Washington had spent 12 years in an institution that taught him how to navigate bureaucracy, how to document everything, and how to persist when the mission required it. Marcus connected with the American Civil Liberties Union and met with an attorney named David Chen, who specialized in Fourth Amendment cases. Chen reviewed everything Marcus had documented, requested the incident reports through Freedom of Information Act requests, and started building a case that went beyond just the raid itself. Chen explained that they could sue for the constitutional violation, for the emotional trauma inflicted on the family, and for the pattern of abuse that suggested this wasn't an isolated incident. When Marcus asked about the cost, Chen told him that the ACLU would provide resources and that several veterans' legal assistance organizations had already offered support. The decision to file the lawsuit came during a family meeting at the kitchen table. Marcus laid out all the options while Teresa and the girls listened. He explained that fighting back would mean depositions, court appearances, and reliving the trauma repeatedly. He acknowledged that they could lose, that the government had resources and legal protections that made these cases difficult. But he also told his daughters that when people with power abuse that power, someone has to stand up and say it was wrong. Zoe asked if suing the government would keep other families safe, and Marcus told her honestly that it might. Amara asked if the men who scared them would get in trouble, and Marcus promised he would do everything possible to make sure they faced consequences. Teresa didn't say anything for a long moment, and then she reached across the table and signed the authorization form that David Chen had prepared. The lawsuit was filed in federal court on June 3rd, 3 months after the raid. It named Derek Morrison individually, along with the 5 other agents who participated, the supervisor who authorized the raid, and the agency itself. The complaint detailed the Fourth Amendment violations, the lack of probable cause, the failure to obtain a warrant, and the terrorizing of a veteran's family. It included affidavits from the psychologist treating the girls, documentation of the property damage, and Marcus's own detailed account of everything that happened. The complaint also included something that David Chen had discovered during his research, a pattern of similar raids conducted by Morrison's unit that suggested systematic disregard for constitutional protections. Chen requested 47 case files for raids Morrison had conducted over the past 18 months, and he noticed that nearly all of them involved minority families, and nearly none of them had proper warrants. ICE responded to the lawsuit exactly as Morrison expected they would. The agency filed a motion to dismiss based on qualified immunity, arguing that the agents had acted in good faith based on the information available to them, and that they couldn't be held personally liable for mistakes made during the course of their duties. The government's lawyers argued that the anonymous tip provided sufficient cause for the raid, that exigent circumstances eliminated the warrant requirement, and that any emotional trauma suffered by the family was an unfortunate but unavoidable consequence of necessary law enforcement. They painted Morrison as a dedicated agent doing a difficult job in challenging circumstances, and they suggested that Marcus Washington was trying to profit from a routine immigration enforcement action. David Chen read the government's response and smiled for the first time since taking the case. He had been hoping they would claim qualified immunity because it gave him the opportunity to prove that Morrison's actions were so clearly unconstitutional that no reasonable agent could have believed they were lawful. Chen started the discovery process by requesting Morrison's personnel file, his training records, and all communications related to the raid on Marcus Washington's home. What he found in those documents would change everything about how this case proceeded, and it would expose a level of negligence that even Chen hadn't anticipated. The fight was just beginning, and Marcus Washington had made it clear that he wasn't backing down until every person responsible faced the consequences of what they had done to his family. David Chen sat in his office at 11 p.m. on a Thursday night, surrounded by documents that the government had been forced to turn over during discovery, and what he was reading made him angry in a way that 15 years of civil rights law had rarely achieved. The initial anonymous tip that had justified the raid on Marcus Washington's home consisted of exactly 3 sentences submitted through an online portal. The tipster claimed that a man named Marco Vasquez lived at 2847 Maple Street, that he was undocumented, and that he worked construction jobs for cash. There was no phone number attached to the tip, no name, no follow-up information, and absolutely nothing that any reasonable agent would consider credible intelligence. Chen kept reading and found the part that made his hands shake with rage. The IP address attached to the tip traced back to a computer belonging to Marcus's neighbor 2 doors down, a man named Gerald Hutchins who had filed noise complaints against 3 different black families on the street over the past 4 years. The document trail showed exactly how little effort Derek Morrison had put into verifying the tip before authorizing a tactical raid on an American citizen's home. Morrison had received the tip at 4:17 p.m. on a Monday, spent 6 minutes checking a database that showed no Marco Vasquez at that address, and then marked the operation as approved without conducting any additional research. He didn't check property records that would have shown Marcus Washington owned the home. He didn't search social media that would have revealed Marcus's military service. He didn't do a basic internet search that would have pulled up Marcus's name associated with that address in public records. Morrison saw a Hispanic-sounding name, saw an address in a predominantly minority neighborhood, and decided that was enough. Chen found an internal email where Morrison told his team to be ready for a 5:45 a.m. entry, and the email included a line that made Chen's stomach turn. Morrison had written that early morning raids in these neighborhoods were more effective because subjects were less likely to have time to destroy evidence or flee. Chen dug deeper into Morrison's history and discovered a pattern that went far beyond negligence into something that looked like systematic civil rights violations. Over the past 18 months, Morrison had conducted 47 warrantless raids in the Richmond area. Chen cross-referenced the addresses with census data and found that 41 of those raids occurred in neighborhoods where the minority population exceeded 60%. He found that Morrison had a 91% failure rate, meaning that in 43 of those 47 raids, the person Morrison was looking for either didn't live at that address or was already in custody or had been deported years earlier. Chen requested the case files for all 47 raids and discovered that Morrison used the same justification every single time, claiming exigent circumstances based on the risk of flight, even though nothing in the tips he received suggested any imminent danger or flight risk. The depositions began in September, 6 months after the lawsuit was filed. Chen started with the 5 agents who had participated in the raid, and their testimony revealed just how unprepared they had been for what they were walking into that morning. Agent Michael Torres testified that he had never seen the tip before the raid, that Morrison briefed them in the parking lot at 5:30 a.m., and that Morrison told them they were looking for an undocumented immigrant who might be armed and dangerous. Torres admitted under oath that he saw the military shadow box in Marcus's living room during the raid, but didn't mention it to Morrison because he assumed it belonged to someone else. Agent Sarah Kim testified that she was the one who finally ran Marcus's name through the database after 10 minutes of searching the house, and that she immediately realized they were in the wrong place. But Morrison ordered the team to finish the search anyway because they were already there. Derek Morrison's deposition lasted 8 hours, and Chen methodically destroyed every justification Morrison tried to offer. Morrison claimed the tip was credible because it included specific details, but Chen showed him the 3-sentence submission and asked what details he was referring to. Morrison claimed he had conducted due diligence, but Chen walked him through the 6-minute gap between receiving the tip and approving the raid. Morrison claimed exigent circumstances, but Chen made him explain what emergency existed at 5:47 a.m. that couldn't have waited for a warrant. Morrison's lawyer objected repeatedly, but the damage was done. The deposition transcript showed an agent who had treated constitutional protections as optional and had never seriously considered that he might be raiding the wrong home. When Chen asked Morrison if he had ever apologized to Marcus Washington, Morrison said he didn't believe an apology was warranted because he had been doing his job. The defense's attempt to claim qualified immunity fell apart during expert testimony. Chen brought in Professor Amanda Richardson, a constitutional law scholar from Georgetown, who had written extensively on Fourth Amendment protections. Richardson testified that the law regarding warrantless searches had been clearly established for decades, that Morrison's claimed exigent circumstances didn't meet any recognized legal standard, and that no reasonable agent could have believed this raid was constitutional. She walked the jury through Supreme Court precedents that explicitly prohibited exactly the kind of search Morrison had conducted, cases that dated back to the 1960s, that made it crystal clear that anonymous tips required corroboration before they could justify warrantless entry into someone's home. Richardson stated plainly that Morrison had violated clearly established law, which meant qualified immunity didn't apply. Chen also called former ICE agent Thomas Walker, who had retired after 22 years with the agency and now worked as a consultant on law enforcement practices. Walker reviewed Morrison's pattern of raids and testified that Morrison's approach violated every standard protocol that ICE training emphasized. Walker explained that proper procedure required agents to verify tips through multiple sources, to obtain warrants except in genuine emergencies, and to conduct surveillance before tactical entries. He testified that Morrison's 91% failure rate would have triggered immediate retraining or removal from field operations in any properly supervised unit, and that the fact Morrison was allowed to continue conducting these raids suggested a systemic failure in oversight. When the defense attorney asked if mistakes happened in law enforcement, Walker agreed they did, but he clarified that 43 mistakes following the exact same pattern over 18 months wasn't a mistake. It was a policy. The emotional centerpiece of the trial came when Marcus took the stand in his Marine dress blues, wearing every medal he had earned during 12 years of service. Chen walked him through his military record slowly and deliberately, making sure the jury understood exactly who Derek Morrison had treated like a criminal. Marcus described earning his Silver Star in Fallujah, pulling 2 Marines from a burning vehicle while taking enemy fire, suffering burns on his hands that still caused him pain. He described the Purple Heart he received after shrapnel tore through his shoulder, the months of physical therapy, the decision to stay in the Marines despite the injury because he believed in the mission. He described coming home after 3 tours, buying a house in the neighborhood where he grew up, trying to build a quiet life with his family after years of war. Then Chen asked Marcus to describe the morning of March 15th, and Marcus's voice stayed steady as he walked the jury through every moment of terror. He described waking to the sound of his door being destroyed, seeing rifles pointed at his face, hearing his daughter scream. He described trying to show Morrison his military ID and being told he was lying. He described watching his wife being held back by armed agents while his children cried on the stairs. He described the 12 minutes that felt like hours, the violation of watching strangers tear through his home, the humiliation of being treated like a threat in the country he had bled for. When Chen asked how the raid had affected his family, Marcus's voice finally cracked. He talked about Amara's nightmares, about Zoe's fear of anyone in uniform, about Teresa waking up in panic attacks. He talked about the therapy bills, the damaged sense of safety, the conversations he never thought he would have to have with his daughters, about why the people who were supposed to protect them had hurt them instead. The defense attorney tried to shake Marcus during cross-examination, suggesting that he was exaggerating the trauma for financial gain, implying that a combat veteran shouldn't be so affected by a simple raid. Marcus looked at the attorney and said something that Chen would later describe as the moment the trial was won. Marcus said that he had faced enemy combatants who were trying to kill him, and he understood that threat. But having armed agents from his own government invade his home and terrorize his family was a different kind of violation, because it came from people who were supposed to uphold the Constitution he had sworn to defend. He said he had trusted that the system would protect him because he had given 12 years of his life to that system, and Derek Morrison had proven that trust was misplaced. The jury watched him say those words in his dress blues with his medals displayed, and several of them were visibly emotional. Chen introduced the psychological evaluations that had been conducted on both Amara and Zoe, detailed reports from Dr. Lisa Patel, who had been treating the girls for 7 months. Dr. Patel testified that both children showed clear symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, that Amara had regressed in her social development, and that Zoe experienced anxiety attacks triggered by loud noises or unexpected visitors. She explained that childhood trauma of this kind could have lasting effects that might require years of treatment, and that the girls' sense of safety in their own home had been fundamentally damaged. When the defense suggested the girls would have been fine if their parents hadn't made such a big deal about the raid, Dr. Patel responded coldly that children don't develop PTSD from events their parents exaggerate. They develop PTSD from experiencing genuine terror, and that minimizing their trauma was exactly the kind of response that made recovery harder. The final piece of Chen's case came from documents he had subpoenaed from ICE headquarters. He found the memo that should have ended Derek Morrison's career long before he raided Marcus Washington's home. 15 months before the raid, an internal review had flagged Morrison's unit for an unusually high number of complaints related to warrantless searches and mistaken identity raids. The review recommended additional training on Fourth Amendment protocols and closer supervision of Morrison's tactical operations. The recommendations were filed and ignored. Morrison's supervisor, a man named Robert Carver, who was also named in the lawsuit, had signed off on the review and then allowed Morrison to continue operating exactly as he had before. Chen introduced this memo into evidence and asked the jury to consider what it meant that the agency knew Morrison was violating people's rights and chose to do nothing about it. When Chen rested his case, he had painted a picture of systematic negligence, racial profiling, and constitutional violations that went far beyond one bad raid. He had shown that Derek Morrison had treated Fourth Amendment protections as suggestions, that his supervisors had enabled that behavior, and that Marcus Washington's family had paid the price for a broken system. The defense's case lasted 2 days and consisted mainly of arguing that Morrison had made an honest mistake based on incomplete information. They tried to portray him as a dedicated agent working in difficult circumstances, but every argument rang hollow against the mountain of evidence Chen had presented. When the defense attorney suggested during closing arguments that ICE agents deserve the benefit of the doubt when making split-second decisions, Chen stood up during his rebuttal and reminded the jury that Morrison had hours to verify his information before the raid and years of clearly established law telling him he needed a warrant, and he had ignored both. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. When they came back, the foreman read a verdict that found Derek Morrison personally liable for violating Marcus Washington's Fourth Amendment rights, found that qualified immunity did not apply because the law was clearly established, and found the agency liable for failing to properly train and supervise Morrison, despite knowing about his pattern of constitutional violations. The verdict included compensatory damages and punitive damages that reflected the jury's conclusion that this wasn't just a mistake, it was a deliberate disregard for the rights of American citizens. Marcus sat next to Teresa and held her hand as the verdict was read, And for the first time since the morning of March 15th, he felt like justice might actually be possible. The jury awarded Marcus Washington $19.5 million in total damages, split between $4.5 million in compensatory damages for the trauma inflicted on his family and $15 million in punitive damages, designed to send a message that constitutional violations carried real consequences. The courtroom went silent as the numbers were read, and Marcus felt Teresa's hand squeeze his so hard it hurt. Derek Morrison sat at the defense table with his face blank, but his career was over before he left the building. Within 48 hours, Morrison was fired from ICE, along with another agent who had participated in multiple questionable raids. 3 other agents received suspensions without pay, and Morrison's supervisor, Robert Carver, was demoted and transferred out of the Richmond office, pending a separate Department of Justice investigation into the unit's practices. Marcus stood on the courthouse steps afterward, facing cameras and reporters, still wearing his dress blues because David Shen had suggested the visual would matter. He gave a statement that was short and direct, the kind of communication his Marine training had taught him. He said that he had fought for the Constitution in Iraq, and he shouldn't have had to fight for it again in his own home. He said the money didn't erase what happened to his daughters, but it proved that nobody was above the law, not even federal agents who thought their badges made them untouchable. He thanked the jury for listening, thanked his legal team for fighting, and thanked the other families who had come forward with their own stories of raids that never should have happened. The verdict created ripples that extended far beyond Marcus's case. Within 3 months, the decision was cited in 12 other lawsuits against ICE for similar warrantless raids, and several of those cases resulted in settlements before trial. The Department of Justice launched a formal civil rights investigation into ICE raid practices in 4 states, focusing specifically on the use of anonymous tips and the failure to obtain warrants. Congress held hearings where Marcus was invited to testify about his experience, and his testimony led to proposed legislation requiring stricter oversight of immigration enforcement operations and eliminating qualified immunity protections for agents who conducted warrantless searches without genuine exigent circumstances. The law hadn't passed yet, but the conversation had shifted in ways that mattered. Marcus used part of the settlement to pay off the mortgage on the house that ICE had violated, ensuring that his daughters would always have a home that truly belonged to them. He set up education funds for Amara and Zoe that would cover their college expenses and then some. Then he did something that surprised even Teresa. He and his wife established a foundation called Shield and Home, dedicated to providing legal assistance to American citizens who had been wrongly targeted by immigration enforcement. The foundation partnered with the ACLU and several veterans organizations to offer free legal representation, help with filing complaints, and support for families dealing with the trauma of unlawful raids. Within the first year, Shield and Home helped 23 families file civil rights lawsuits, and 19 of those cases ended in settlements or verdicts in favor of the families. Derek Morrison faced consequences that went beyond losing his job. The Department of Justice filed federal civil rights charges against him for willful violation of constitutional rights under color of law, the same statute used to prosecute police officers who abused their authority. Morrison's case was pending trial, but he was looking at potential prison time if convicted. The other agents who participated in the raid on Marcus's home faced lesser charges or administrative penalties, but all of them lost their qualified immunity protections in the civil case, which meant they were personally liable for damages. Morrison's supervisor, Robert Carver, was forced into early retirement after the internal investigation found that he had ignored multiple warning signs about Morrison's pattern of constitutional violations. The changes within ICE came slowly, but they came. The agency implemented new protocols requiring supervisors to personally verify the credibility of tips before authorizing tactical raids, mandating that agents obtain warrants except in clearly defined emergency situations, and creating an independent review board to investigate complaints about warrantless searches. The protocols weren't perfect and enforcement was inconsistent, but Marcus's case had created accountability where none had existed before. Other agents in other offices knew that Derek Morrison's career had ended because he thought constitutional protections didn't apply to the people he was targeting, and that knowledge changed behavior in ways that policy memos never could. 1 year after the verdict, Marcus stood in a community center in Richmond teaching a Know Your Rights workshop to about 40 people, most of them immigrants or family members of immigrants who wanted to understand what protections they had if ICE came to their door. He taught them about the Fourth Amendment, about their right to refuse entry without a warrant, about how to document everything if a raid happened anyway. He showed them the forms to file complaints, gave them the contact information for legal aid organizations, and shared his own story as proof that fighting back was possible even when it seemed hopeless. Amar and Zoe sat in the back of the room with Teresa, watching their father turn his trauma into protection for others. And for the first time since the raid, they seemed proud rather than scared. Marcus had received offers from multiple organizations, asking him to work as a consultant or spokesperson, but he had turned most of them down because his real job was at the shipping company, and his real mission was his family. He did interviews occasionally when he thought it would help other families or push for policy changes, but he wasn't trying to build a career out of what happened to him. He was simply a man who had been wronged and who refused to let that wrong go unanswered. The settlement money was significant, but what mattered more to Marcus was that Derek Morrison would never raid another family's home, that other agents knew there were consequences for treating citizens like criminals, and that his daughters understood that justice was possible even when power seemed absolute. The final update came 18 months after the verdict, when 3 of the agents involved in the raid on Marcus's home were criminally convicted of civil rights violations. They received sentences ranging from probation to 2 years in federal prison, and all of them lost their law enforcement credentials permanently. Derek Morrison's criminal trial was still pending, but prosecutors had offered him a plea deal that included prison time, and his lawyers were reportedly advising him to take it. The legal process was slow and frustrating, but it was moving in the direction of accountability, and that was more than most families in Marcus's situation ever got. Marcus Washington never wanted to be the face of a civil rights case or a symbol of resistance against government overreach. He had wanted to serve his country, come home, raise his family, and live quietly in the neighborhood where he grew up. Derek Morrison took that quiet life away on March 15th at 5:47 a.m., but Marcus had taken something from Morrison in return. He had taken the illusion that badges and authority meant immunity from consequences. He had proven that a citizen with documentation, determination, and the Constitution on his side could defeat a system designed to protect its own. And he had created a legacy that would protect other families long after his own wounds had healed. That legacy was worth more than $19.5 million, and it would last longer than any verdict.